doing that X number of months before, and then you fell into step, and in 24 hours you were a veteran, and then you moved on, the mission.
You also wind up in Foxhalls with the fire over your head that you, outside of the wood, you told me about it.
Well, yeah, there were many different places and times.
Like you did nothing but go on patrol.
Yeah.
That's not true.
Was in the sector. These were recon patrols. They were not combat patrols. You didn't fight unless you absolutely had to. I mean, you tried to get around without people knowing that you were around. And this wasn't too easy.
Okay. This is the continuation tape 2 of Jerry McCarthy. It is August 30th, 1997, and we are in Columbus, Ohio.
Okay.
We can go ahead and continue the story.
Yeah. So, there was many a time where we didn't have, the platoon just did not have a mission. And only if the 57s were to be brought into play. And really, what happened there, the Germans were really in general retreat. They didn't want to admit it. They kept this business of what we call the rear guard action. And some of it, maybe on a massive level, a lot of it on a local level, depending upon what road they wanted to keep open, what rail supply they wanted to keep open, what were they trying to protect for the next 24 hours. And then many a time it would be just a supply dump. So they get enough time to move as much as they could and then set it on fire and blow it up. So that's basically, what we were up against. And then that was, except when we were off the line in February, we had a pretty good break. There wasn't like an Armored Division mission for us in the 7th Army. The 3rd Army was moving back into their old territory, coming south, more south from being up where they were, the whole month of January. So now they were moving back. And then we went to Forbach near Saarbrücken as a specific geographical location for you on this. And there was a lot of activity going on up there. We were going to be placed in blocking positions, but we were going to be placed in blocking divisions that were under, actual fire, artillery at any time, especially. Small arms fire was pretty much pushed away. We didn't go into Forbach. Our C Company went into Forbach, and B Company went into a place called St. Wendel. And initially, again, the AT platoon was left behind, and supposedly somebody received a radio message, for us to move up with the rest of the company. And three tracks and the guns and everything, and our platoon sergeant took off in the dead of night. And we could see that the place was lit up by artificial moonlight, and there was a lot of artillery fire going on. There was a lot of rocket fire going on, and it was like the 4th of July. And we pulled into the outskirts of the town, and there was somebody from the company out there. And it was about 2 o'clock in the morning now, and the first thing I heard, was I was in the track, and I heard somebody say, "What are you guys doing up here?" And somebody said, "Well, we got an order. We got a message to get on with." Well, get the tracks in, you know, off the road, get them up against the houses, and get out of the track and get into a house real quick. So we did that. And we went down into a dugout underneath the first house. And the next morning, there didn't seem to be too much going on, and came up, and the track had been was full of not the steel part, but the canvas, and what we used to call a squad box, where there was extras, supplies in there for anybody needed something, you know, toilet articles and things like that, you know, a deck of cards. It was a big box that's set on top of the front of the track, over the cab of the track. And that was full of holes, you know, with shaving cream and soap and junk all over the place, you know, and there were holes in the canvas from what was raining in while we were down in the cellar. So, and then we didn't spend too much time out there by the track, because I mean it was highly unvisable, and because there were rockets coming in. And at any time, I mean, it could be sporadic, you know. There were some tanks moving in the street, moving in and out, but they were mostly communication tanks, you know, or they were bringing in some sort of a supply, and then they would move off again. And then every once in a while, during the day, the railroad track and the crossroad there would receive a good pasting, because it was zeroed in. They knew that traffic would be moving in that area, so they would just remind you, you know, that they knew that, and they kept you away, kept everybody, you know. But we were no more than, you know, from here to out into the main lobby. I mean, you know, watching some of this stuff. And they were on the far end of the town, and every once in a while they would shoot an 88 right down the street, you know, and that thing would, you know, would see this white flash go flying by. And there would only like be one person up in the house in the front part of it with a radio, so we could keep in touch with the CP that was in another building, you know, down the block. And we just stayed away from anything, but we couldn't figure that out. It was just that they did that, you know, every once in a while. You know, you just never knew. I mean, maybe somebody crossed the street and, well, you know, they took a shot at him with an artillery piece. You know, that's the way it amounts to. That was the famous 88 weapon. And at night we would go out on patrol and hope that you could get across, you know, the railroad tracks. There was a couple of times we couldn't get across. There was just too much coming in, and it was extremely dangerous to try to push it. So just come back and wait an hour, 2 hours, or whatever it led up, and see if they were, what kind of games they were playing, you know, with the firing. I mean, meanwhile, every so often there would be a fantastic explosion, you know, in the backyard of this place, or, you know, off the roof of the house next door, or whatever, and that was, you know, shelling that was coming in. And we were pretty tired at this point, you know, because of the lack of sleep, mainly. And, you know, you didn't get used to it, but I mean, you knew this is it. I mean, you fall off, and you didn't know how long it was going to be. That's all there was to it. I remember one time went down into the cellar, and there was German people that lived down there, a mother and a father and a young boy, and they had bunk beds, and they had a stove, and they had a table in the middle of the floor, and God knows how long they had been down there, you know, living down there, because this whole area had been really under siege. And we were moving in what was going to be like near the end of that siege. But anyway, we always had your field jacket on and your OD clothing, and your helmet was on all the time. And underneath it, I was wearing the knit cap, you know. And I remember going downstairs, and they had some preserves on a table, and maybe I ate something or whatever it is. And the next thing I know, I just fell over on the table, sound asleep. And when I woke up, and I put my hand up, you know, and it, what's this, you know, sort of thing, and that was a load of jelly. That was now in my wool cap, you know. And I don't know what I did about that, but I mean, that was the way it was, sort of thing. So eventually they pulled us out of there. We went up into Saarbrücken itself, and we were assigned clearing some major buildings, in that they were German headquarter type buildings. And they had apparently a lot of personnel files in there, and I don't know whether they were government files or whatever heck else, you know. Because I remember somebody from a staff section or maybe an intelligence section or whatever came in and made us aware, you know, don't fool around with these files. I mean, don't start throwing them all over the floor, open the drawers, you know, and throw them all over, because, you know, a lot of guys had this sort of like playpen act thing, you know, and they liable to do anything, you know, that in destroying things, you know, that they really shouldn't be destroying. You know. So, you know, I remember being warned on that. Not that I was scaling records around and everything, but some other guys had pulled drawers open in this one building, and they were dumping them out, and they were scaling Hitler's picture around, because they took it off the wall, you know, and they were smashing them and things like that. So there were a lot of pictures, so there was a lot of scaling of pictures, or, you know, things of that nature. Then back down in the street and through a major park in town. And all I could think of was, gee, this is ridiculous. Here I am walking through a beautiful park that was dug up with defensive positions, you know, trenches and so forth. There was some green bushes, you know, and grass and all that, you know, was there. And it just seemed kind of, you know, one of those strange things that you're thinking about, you know. Here this crazy thing is going on, and look at this beautiful park, you know, all dug up with their defensive positions in it, you know. And then I remember the 69th Infantry moving through, and I don't know, we eventually were called, you know, back from whatever we were doing, and met up with the tracks again, and took off. And we didn't know where we were going this time, but it turned out that we had been transferred on loan, that is, to the Third Army. We didn't know that at the time. And then this was another night drive. You always moved at night most of the time, you know. And we drove and drove and drove, you know, and every once in a while we were buttoned up. We had the canvas zipped all around in the back, and the guys were trying to sleep in the back. And the particular position I had, I would have to go back to Colmar with this one, because it was raining when we went through Colmar, heavy rain. And the particular position I had in the back of the track had a hole in the canvas. So there was a lot of, you know, this business, you know, stopping, starting again. And when you when you're pushing 9 tons around, which was a track weight, you know, with all the garbage on it and so forth, you know, and the canvas, you know, was bellied a bit, and the water would be collecting in there, you know, and then it would slosh back, and of course it would come right down through the hole, right? So, you know, if you weren't wet from being outside, made sure that you got wet inside, you know. I mean, everything, you know, it's just soppy wet. That's all. I mean, it's all, I'm wet. What are you going to do about it? Of course, the guy next to you, he had no room. You know, you sat just like this, you know, very close to one another. In fact, I mean, you know, knee locked into knee almost. And if you felt the track, you might be having trouble, you know, going over on the edge of a roll. There was a roll bar underneath. You reached over and grabbed the whole of that thing, so, and hung on in case this thing was really going to pitch. And everybody was really back there, you know. Well, you saw how much room it was, and then visualize that with all the garbage that you had. And fortunately, that track never went over, but we did slide, you know, off the road one night. We did actually have tracks that went all the way and rolled off right off the road and rolled over down with a full squad, you know. We lost an officer that way. And of course, he was up front in the turret and so forth. You know, didn't have enough time to get out from under or whatever, or through him, and then the track. But if that happened, you know, and then everybody got out and took a look at the situation to figure out, you know, how we're going to do this. Sometimes the track would be just like this. And the best thing to do then was to just drive it down, you know, drive it right completely off the road, you know, and try to go along until you could get a position and to bring it back up again. But anyway, we arrived up in the vicinity of Trier, Germany, and word got around us that, gee, we must be in the Third Army to be this far. And we found out that we were. And I remember standing on high ground, which was safe, in a particular assembly area, you know, where they were putting us together. And there was off in the distance, I turned around and looked. It was a bright sunny day in March, and I saw this hospital complex going up. You know, you could see the big hospital crosses, you know, and it was a tent city. And that meant that there was probably a good-sized evacuation hospital being set up. And I turned around to another fellow that was standing there, and I said, "You see that?" And he said, "Yeah, I see it." I said, "You know what that means?" And he said, "No." I said, "There's going to be some big operation that's going to kick off up here." And that was just my own estimate. I mean, I didn't know that much. But once the medical people move in, you know, behind you, that means something really big is going to happen. This is much bigger than your own battalion medics and things like that. It's just not a old simple aid station. And then the Third Army personnel came down right into the units from their staff, the Third Army staff officers and so forth, and they inventoried equipment. You know, they want to know exactly what we had and how much of it we had, and they looked at the condition of the vehicles, and they were even going to requisition, you know, right down to the patch on your shoulder that you needed. They counted every damn thing in sight, and eventually, I think, well, the officers had a meeting, and that was, I think they were actually called into a meeting above our own division level. There were people that were more know more about that than myself, actually. But when they came back, they'll give us the information, and they told us, you know, verbatim, what was expected. This is a whole new ball game. You're in the Third Army, and the mission was going to be a big one. And we were told when we did jump off or received the orders to jump off that there would be no stopping. And if a vehicle was hit, you were supposed to get on to the nearest thing that moved. Keep right on going. And there was no such thing as assisting an individual who would be wounded and injured and so forth on a side road. Just forget it. Keep going, because we'll take care of that, you know, sort of thing. And then the date and the time came, and we took off and just kept going right over the German border. And whatever was in the way, or people decided to be in the way and so forth, you know, they were just pushed aside and just right on through until our particular combat command, our particular company was told to stop. And there was other parts of the division that kept on moving. And one of the problems was beginning to develop that there were so many German prisoners that somebody had to keep them in a pen. And we got part of that assignment. And we had about 3,000 that came back, because they were just told to keep walking up the road from the forward units. And we had them in a big open field, and we had a railroad embankment, and we put a track on that end and put a track on this end. And then there was some sort of a stream at the far end of this land, and that was like a boundary down there. And there was no other way, you know, not setting up, you know, wire or anything like that. And we let them mill around down there during the daytime. But as they came in, part of the mission was to go down and empty their pockets and take their boots off and take away everything that they had. Their weapons had already been taken away. Their steel helmets had been taken away, and things of that nature. But here and there, you would find a knife that wasn't an issue type of knife. It was just a knife that a German soldier was using, you know. It wasn't going to use it for a weapon. These fellas weren't going to fight anymore. They would absolutely, we could walk right down through the line into thousands of them. And we had boxes and boxes and boxes of this stuff that we took away from them. And then we fed them. They got sea rations the same as we did. And at nighttime, just to let them know their boundary, we would just open up with the 50 caliber machine guns and shoot them down the line. And they got the message. And I saw a great thing there as far as control was concerned, and that was issuing orders. How are orders going to be issued, you know, to 3,000 people standing out in a big field? So they got a hold of a sergeant major, German sergeant major, and he understood English and so forth, and he would stand up on the embankment and he would issue the orders that were given to us, and they all turned around and faced with by the numbers, and he issued orders out to them, you know, about conduct and where they would do and what they wouldn't do, and there would be no fires, you know, and things that are, you know, camp things that you would not do at that. But it was great. He controlled that whole thing. As soon as he opened his mouth, everybody paid attention. It wasn't a one that even moved a muscle. And I spent most of their time cleaning up as best as they could. And they had some of them still had ponchos, so they could set up tent, little pup tent. They'd team up, you know, the same as we would do. If we carried a shelter halves, you know, you get two guys together, you got yourself a pup tent, right? And of course, when I mentioned that was another piece of equipment that we actually did not have. That was straight infantry had this equipment, and they were supposed to carry part of the shelter half, but we didn't carry it. When we went into combat, we only carried the weapon and ammunition, trench knife, hand grenades, and whatever you wanted to put in your pockets. Nothing else. You wore your field jacket, depending upon how cold it was out, how you felt about that. I mean, sometimes later on I would just wear my waterproof coveralls, but underneath that I had an OD shirt, or I had the sweater. I had a heavy undershirt on, you know, and it was like, gee, how am I going to dress today, you know, for this operation? Should I take my field jacket or should I leave it, you know? Because in the field jacket pocket, you know, you might break down your K ration, so you had, you know, cheese in this pocket and chocolate in that pocket and Nescafe in another pocket, you know. And maybe in your helmet you had gum and the latest Stars and Stripes, and put that up in there, and maybe a toothbrush or something, maybe a piece of soap, whatever you wanted. Some guys always had a deck of cards up there on the inside of the helmet, in the helmet liner. So that's just one of those things that you did. It's how you lived. And you were very, very light. Sometimes we didn't even have an entrenching tool with us. And it depended. Sometimes it would come down and say, we're going to be in a field operation, or you better take your entrenching tool with you. Okay, so you strap that on and went off. And depending upon how the situation worked out, or you might have to dig a little bit. If you were wound up in a farm field, the furrows were great because you were already down that much into the ground, and a lot of times, I mean, that's plenty, you know, to be out of any strafing fire, you know. But then you dug from there, and you dug out as much as you possibly could. If it looked like this is going to be a situation you're going to stay, and you dug a little deeper. And just as soon as you had the whole set and everything, the order came down to move out. You know. But it was a case, you know, somebody would say, what is it going to be, foxhole or slit trenches? So, and a lot of times, we're going to sleep tonight or what? You know, so you dug a slit trench, you know, just as wide as your body and at least 2 feet deep. And then you went in there with your weapon and every damn thing else that you were carrying, and hope that nothing happened, because you didn't take your boots off most of the time. You didn't. Sometimes if we brought the tracks up on a perimeter type of thing, and the tracks were spread out, the whole company of tracks spread out, sometimes they would dig the holes and then back the tracks over it. Of course, that wasn't really a safe situation, because now you were under a track, and damn track ever got hit, you know, forget it. Well, I always used to dig a hole behind the track. And there wasn't much chance of this guy, backing up and so forth. And it was very dangerous around vehicles like that, and having tanks, because sometimes we'd have a tank and a half track and a tank and a half track, down the line. And that was because if there was going to be an attack in the morning, an offensive attack, generally always in the morning, they would all open up before you would move out. Again, it was like 4th of July, best way to explain it, because, we had armor-piercing ammunition, we had tracer ammunition, we had regular, what they call ball ammunition, lead bullets. And I don't know whether anybody has also mentioned this, but the Germans had wooden bullets. Every once in a while you would see evidence of this. And the tip of that wooden bullet was painted purple. That purple was poison. And a wooden bullet would hit and splinter, and splatter all over. And you were actually, blood poisoning and so forth, just too much. I remember one time I fired a rifle into a wall to see what would happen, and the disbursement, was like that. It was all splinters. It was better than a wall. It was like a tornado came through, and hammered a 2x4 into the wall, Fortunately, we never ran against it, but they existed. They were used, I think, primarily in machine guns, because we found them in their positions on a couple occasions. Just a point of information. That attack towards the Rhine at that time was very successful. In that four armored divisions were moving across the Brest. That's like moving 40,000 people, in one shot, and 6 infantry divisions to mop up behind, coming through. And we got up as far as Ludwigshafen and was stopped. It's a large city, and a lot of flak going on up there. And all through this, all you can say is that there were a lot of people in our company and so forth. We're lucky. I mean, things were flying around, and like a lot of people didn't get hit. I mean, things bounced off the track a couple of times. One track, in one of the other platoons, one night, got hit broadside. We were the next track, for instance, and there was a shot like out of the clear blue sky, went right through one side of the track and out the other. And a couple of people were seriously injured. So, you were just a lucky thing. I think I'll take a break.
Okay, great.
A truck company came down and picked up prisoners about 5 days later. And it's very interesting to watch that, because GI drivers were very happy, to be picking up all these people, and they would put them into semi-trailers. Everybody standing up, out in the open. They were 32-foot semi-trailers.
Oh my God.
Some of them were 2.5-ton trucks. These prisoners would have to stand up in the back, and then whatever baggage they had to put that on the ground before they got up. I mean, some of them still carried a pack, and just have a blanket or something in it, and then they used to take everything and throw it up on top of them. I mean, on top of the heads of and shoulders of everybody, right? And then they would take the truck and run it down a short distance and jam the brakes on, and that meant everybody went this way. So they were very compact now.
And where were they headed?
To the rear.
Okay.
We didn't know. It weren't our trucks. Some truck company, that did that type of work in Europe. And then we moved. If you want, well, here's a little interesting story about the time that we lived there. We were living in a building that would be like a roadhouse. A restaurant maybe was there, and a bar and so forth. But there was nothing in it. It was pretty well worked out. But there was at least a complete, kitchen, and there was silverware, and there was dishes and so forth. And somebody went out and got a hold of an English-speaking German. And he turned out to be a guy that was middle-aged or better, and he was a corporal. In civilian life, he had a pretty good job with Woolworth department stores. I mean, like a buyer, I think, or something like that, from what he told us, And he became our waiter and the overseer of the kitchen for us. There's just one platoon. And we gave him our C rations, and I guess he had maybe our K rations too. And we put everything together. If it was all a stew ration, put all the stew ration in a big pot, and he would cook it up and keep things warm. So when we were out, sometimes we'd get a break, and come back in, and whatever, coffee was around, or cocoa, or things of that nature, and we would sit down, and Woolworth was our waiter while we were there. And he was just a guy that's glad to be out of this whole thing, It was over with. And he had been to the United States. He had, he was worked for F.W. Woolworth, And, of course, we treated him, saw that he got some cigarettes or tobacco or something, that he could use. And then we took off and we caught up to the rest of our company. This is X number of days, because they had continued on the move, and continued on the move with the other battalions and the other combat commands and so forth. And then this is when eventually arrived on a doorstep of the Rhine River. And then there was a holdup because they were going to fight for Ludwigsshafen. They were going to delay us and keep a bridge open as long as they possibly could. And when they were really ready to leave, then they blew the bridge, so. But we were trying to do everything to prevent that if we could, but we weren't that lucky. And the companies would, one day, A company would have the point, the next day B company would have the point, and so forth, down the line. And then by the same token, the 1st platoon, 2nd platoon, 3rd platoon, and then the AT platoon. And once in a while, the AT platoon and the company would be given the point. And we just kept on moving that way. And then one night, or one day, I guess it was, late afternoon, we pulled into a meadow area, big meadow, and we were to stay there. But no, I said in the afternoon. That's right, okay. And as soon as we got there, the platoon sergeant went to a meeting, and when he came back, he said, "We're going on a patrol." I figured. So it was going to be maybe 5 men, and he asked me, would I go on a patrol? I mean, we didn't get this business, you will, and all, right off the top. I mean, the sergeant said, "Would you go?" I said, "Sure, I'll go with you," 5 other guys would go. So we went out on this long walking patrol. We went out into the woods, and we had a compass, and he knew how far on that azimuth, you know, we were to walk and look and see whatever, and then walk on this azimuth, you know, for so far. And it was a long distance. We were out for hours and hours and hours, because by the time we come back, it was pitch black. And they left a guard out, you know, on the perimeter, knowing that we would be coming back in this particular area. And we were led in, you know, to the bivouac area. It was so dark that we literally put, you know, one hand on the front of the guy in front of you to walk in. And of course, we were being led into an entirely new area. The tracks had been moved while we were out, and they decided to reposition. And the next morning, the reason we found out, the reason was that we were not going to be the point. We had been the point the day before, and I think the day before that. So an A company was moved up to take the point. And we saw them move out in convoy. It was mounted, you know, convoy. And a short time later, the word come back that they got clobbered. There were some guns up on the road, rear guard action, you know, that began to actually pick them off. You know, like the first track, her third track, and the ninth track, and so forth, and then we're going to work them over, up and down. But those people, you know, bailed out of the tracks, an A company, and they found out, you know, exactly what was going on and what was holding them up and so forth, and then began to get, you know, fire in that direction and eliminate that particular situation. A B company moved out, it would have been our problem, you know, that morning. After we had reached the Rhine River, then it was time to move back south and hook up again into 7th Army territory and down to Worms, Germany. Again, you know, fortunately, they had evacuated a good portion of the whole side of the Rhine, the west side of the Rhine, and were out. So there was sporadic activity. They didn't have anything left, you know, when it came to air cover, you know, so they couldn't come down on us and so forth. We had air cover up. And pretty much when we got down to Worms, Germany, and some infantry organization had taken care of that place, and we were just to stand by in the city, and that standby time was again like early in the morning, after midnight, you know, and into whatever time we were told to move out and down to the crossing, which was a Bailey bridge. Not a Bailey bridge, I should say a pontoon bridge that was put across. And we zipped across that thing in no time at all. And it was all done with just the cat eyes on the track. Everything was blackout, you know. And across the pontoon bridge we went and got on the other side and just went in as far as we possibly could, but then we were actually going overland, sort of. We went off roads there for some period of time. I can remember that because we were out. I don't know. We got into some wooded area because we were out hacking trees down, you know, and brush and clearing a path to actually get through this situation, and that went on all night practically. It was pretty tough work, you know. And I don't know. The next day, I guess we went through some town and back on the road again, you know. And we just kept moving, you know, all the time. So then we were actually on the next major objective was Würzburg. And of course there were the flank towns to be taken as he went, and the combat commands had different situations, you know, and so forth. And we just kept clearing. I think there again, we were trying to get bridges, and every time we get near one, it would be blowing up, you know. And I can remember one night on a railroad embankment, we had to dig in, and we were just going to stay there, I guess, for the whole night. And we were under artillery fire, and the worst thing was white phosphorus, you know, exploding and splashing, and it was just down an embankment. It was a little distance away from my particular position and my buddy's position that was with me. And I remember we were so tired that we literally could not stay awake. We tried, tried very hard. And he was a squad sergeant at the time, and he said, well, we'll try to do this an hour and an hour. And at the same time, we were trying to dig a stupid hole, you know, to get down, and we hit it was almost like solid rock or something, you know, in that particular area, and we just couldn't get down, and we couldn't dig anymore. We were wiped out, and finally it got down to like a half hour apiece, and you had to be awake enough to try to wake the other guy up, you know, and we went back and forth like this. I think where all of a sudden, I think the both of us went to sleep in our foxholes there, you know. Couldn't do it. Yeah, that was all there to it. But anyway, I don't know how long we actually were out, but the firing ceased, and when we woke up, and very early in the morning, you know, daylight probably woke us up, and we moved out of that position. You see, it was always going in someplace in case something happened, you know, and move on, you know. And depending upon how tired you were, I mean, that's where you were going to sleep. You were just, no matter what you did about it, you know. I think the longest I stayed awake was 3 days one time. I mean, literally, with hardly a cat nap, you know, sort of thing. And, you know, people used to wonder, you know, well, I wonder how long we can do that, you know. How long can, we found out that 3 days is about the limit from a medical standpoint, I think, is the way to try to do it anyway. I forget, we got down to Würzburg. Engineers were down there building a bridge, a Bailey Bridge, pushing it out over the Main River. And the night before we arrived there, the British, I think, had British bombers, I think, came over and had a mission to clobber the city of Würzburg, which happens to be a very famous university city. Also, Würzburger beer comes from there, from the 1500s. And maybe population of maybe 300,000. And this place was really just Zippo. It's a shame, but the Burgermeister, the mayor, I understand, would not give up his city. So I've forgotten the name of the castle. It was on this side, on a high ground of the city, and over the river. I mean, looking down over the river. And we had our tanks up on that high ground, and they were firing point blank down across the river into the city. There was an infantry division, I think the 42nd Infantry Division was working down in there also. But the Germans had gone into the sewers in some areas, so, you know, they could pop up, you know, behind you and that thing. We didn't have to get into that mess. we got over our company was ordered over the Bailey Bridge onto the far side, and you were right on the dock. And there were some boats in the water there, you know, barge type boats. And the ruins were still, you know, smoldering and so forth. And we went up into the ruins so we could get up high enough in the ruins and so we could look down. And it was a weird looking picture because the sun was out and the smoke was rising, and you get that, what is it, like a prism effect, you know, going on. And we stayed there for maybe the better part of a day in that particular position. It was an interesting thing, though, when we went across, all of a sudden there was word that the Bailey Bridge was being closed down. Now, we had no idea, you know, what was going to happen here because we didn't know whether it was going to be a counterattack or not, and it was like being the only company over there, and it might have been a company of tanks over with us. And they said, closing the bridge down, you know, we're on this side of the thing, and we got our backs to the water, you know, literally. So it just spread the tracks out and all the people and hope for the best. So what had happened was that the bridge was giving a bit. So the engineers knew what the problem was, and that they had to strengthen the situation before they could open the bridge again. And of course, this was like a major artery. It was everybody lining up, you know, for miles, you know, to come down and across this bridge. From what I understand, this bridge went back to Roman times. You know, of course, in that area, you know, the Romans had, what do we say, roamed around. So it was a shame of these ancient bridges, you know, that were still standing there, were now all being blown, you know, at least one span of the bridge. And of course, in a city like that, I mean, you see a bridge here, and then a little ways down, you see another one. A little ways down, you see another one, you know. The same as across, like in Paris. You know, you look down the Seine River, you know, and you see bridge, 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 right? So eventually they got the bridge strengthened, and more people came over. And then there was a movement out around the city. And in the beginning, they moved some tanks out around the city. And they received some fire, and wasn't much, but it was enough, you know, to they had a skirmish. And then we received word, you know, to start mounted, you know, to move around the city of Würzburg. And as we got on the far side, we came into a pretty good highway, and we were also now in wine country, wine vineyards, you know, the famous Würzburger, you know, wine area and so forth, the Rhine wine. That's one of the places, you know. And there were a lot of Germans up in the vineyards. Most of them, they were scattered, they were trying to get away. The Air Force had been down, fighter planes had been down, you know, and strafed this place, you know, and caught there some of their convoys trying to get out, you know, and there was a lot of trash on the roads, you know, and everything, and off the side of the road. And, you know, most of them were all killed as they were in the vehicles, you know. And some of them were trying to get away up on this side. And we could see them running behind the retaining walls, you know, up there. We just kept firing away at them to keep them down, mainly. If they wanted to come down and surrender, fine. But if they kept running away, we just kept their heads down by firing from the track, you know, up there. And we kept moving, you know, by the same token. I forgot now exactly where I went, what villages or towns, continuing this on the following days. But actually, we were then headed towards Landsberg. That was the next major city, and we were moving now towards Austria. Fortunately, again, there was this business of outskirts of the city of Landsberg. They were retreating, and they were trying to get away as fast as they could. And a lot of them were being captured, And then the concentration camps around there were being liberated. And then we began to see the people in the striped clothing, those that could still walk, out of there. Mm-hmm. I myself can remember being right at the gates of the Landsberg prison with other people. Mm-hmm. But as a personal experience, I was there right in the courtyard of the Landsberg prison, and the prison was packed with American and British and Canadian prisoners, I believe. And they were all yelling out the windows and so forth, And that was, from history, that's an historic thing, to happen to be in the place where the maniac wrote his book. That's where Hitler was confined, 1926, I believe it was, after he was put in prison. So-called prison, he had, I think he had a suite of cells, and he had Rudolf Hess as his assistant, secretary, And after that, we waited. Oh, I saw American fighter aircraft and German Messerschmitts were having a dogfight over the city. There was an American aircraft flying at a certain level, and the Germans were flying higher, and they came out of the sun. And the next thing you know, we saw some American ships, falling down out of the sky. And the Germans would just kept, circling around up there, and there weren't they weren't low enough, for us to do anything. And we had a lot of American troops in this area besides, the 12th, being there, but there was no anti-aircraft in the immediate vicinity for us. There was German anti-aircraft guns across the river, and they were firing across the river every so often, even though it was one or two guns or whatever it was, because I remember shells going right through the tops of the trees where we were. And they probably were finally silenced or whatever, but that happened, You always did not know what else is going to happen or how much of it is going to happen, That was always the feeling, And eventually, there were some other American fighters, or they get on the radios or so, and they came in over the top of the Germans, and they started knocking those Messerschmitts out of the air left and right. And one guy was smart enough or stupid enough, I don't know which way what he thought he was doing, but he came down real low and flew right parallel to us. We could see, you could see the pilot in his greenhouse and his aircraft, and he was going that way. Actually, he was hightailing. That's a tactical maneuver, actually, to come down, if it's your own people that are down there, to give you protection. That's what it is, So all kinds of American guns opened up as this guy flew by, but he got out of there real quick, and he was gone. Then we crossed a bridge there in the dead of night. It was a railroad bridge. And it was open like, I think, 22 hours for troops and 2 hours for supplies, all kinds of supplies, you know. And it was precise, you know, timing. As one thing stopped, the other thing had to start. And I remember that we had to lead the track over the bridge so the driver knew whether to stay right, stay left, stay right, stay left. And this thing was like a bump, 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 you know, over the railroad ties. And you were looking at the cat eyes, the vehicle in front of you, his tail lights and so forth. And I remember I went out on the hood of the track and I sat out there on top of the hood of the track, and somebody was standing up in the turret, and you would indicate, you know, too close, move back a little bit, go right, go left, and this was a long haul over this bridge. It was slow, and we wound up in whatever the town was. I mean, on the other side of Landsberg, probably suburb, or maybe it was part of Landsberg. I don't know. I never went back to find out whether there was a connection or not. But that was the only bridge that was open in that particular area. I'm not quite sure. From the engineers, you would have to get information like that, how much they had to do to secure it or something, but they didn't get a chance to completely blow it out of existence. And we went into what apparently was a German, well, I think it was a German hospital, military hospital complex. I don't know, you know, if they had a school there, German OCS, for instance, or some other type of school, but this place would handle a good-sized number of troops for training and for billeting. Permanent big brick buildings were there. And one of our missions was to clear the buildings out. All during this time we were hauling, you know, the 57s with it, but we weren't using them. They just didn't have missions, you know, to use them. We kept hauling these guns around though. And I remember being assigned to clear this big building with another buddy. I mean, it must have been a city block long, and it must have been four stories high. And we found out when we got into it that it was a hospital. Nobody in it, you know, not a soul. Well, I'm jumping ahead. Patients or staff. But there were a couple of clowns in the building, and they had weapons. And as we went out and had to go out of one building and start across a courtyard, they took a shot at us. You know, and we saw somebody up in a window and then ducked down, so forth, and we fired back, you know, through the window, just the two of us, because that was our particular mission. And this fellow I was with had, I'll take off and I'll get in that entryway. And he said, just cover me. Okay, so he took off, and sure enough, a head popped up, you know, when I started firing back. And the head decided that it was better off, you know, to get out of the window. And he got to the entryway, and then he said, come on, you know what I'm saying to myself, wow. You know, we had moved out into the court. There was a tree, and there was a bale of hay out there. I don't know what it was doing out there. But I mean, that was going to be from our first leap, you know, to get there. And if we did have anybody firing at us, I mean, they would maybe hit the tree, or hit the bale of hay, and so forth. It was only rifle fire. And then I said to myself, I took a deep breath. I said, okay, I'm coming, you know. And I zigzagged, you know, going back and forth all the way across. And there was only one shot. I had 1 or 2 shots fired at me when I was near the bale of hay. And, and I got up and just ran like crazy and got into the building. We were carrying M1s, rifles with us. And when we got into the building, then we could hear footsteps running across the terrazzo floor. So he said, well, I'll go down this end and you take this end. And I said, okay. And then we started going up the staircases, you know. And every once in a while you would hear the boots, you know, running. And this guy was running upstairs. I don't know how far he thought he was going to go, but he tried to check out some rooms. There didn't seem to be anything around. Nobody else seemed to be in the building. And my buddy caught this guy at the far end of the building, and we cleared it. And we just came back down, and the rest of the platoon had cleared their areas and so forth, and we will come back to consolidate and then find some apartments to stay in that night. We were pulled out. We didn't have to go out like on a guard duty post and so forth. So it just gave us some downtime. I forget how long we stayed there in the vicinity of Landsberg. I guess the next thing that happened was the drive down to get a bridge across the Danube River. And B Company was in point, and then A Company was in point, and so forth. And we missed a bridge one night that was blown just before we got there, you know. And then that was another hell night of fire going on. And the next morning, I think A Company, you know, got the mission, and we went off in one direction, and they went off in another direction, and everybody was racing for the Danube River, and they found the bridge in Dillingen. And the next thing we got the call, you know, to dovetail down to that same town, you know, and they had gotten in and gotten across the bridge, and by the time we arrived, you know, there was wall-to-wall traffic down there, and we could see that there was a lot of firing that went on, and they captured a lot of people on the banks of the Danube, and we were assigned again to go clear buildings out, you know. I went to clear out a church and a convent area, and another building was a brewery. And it was weird, you know, walking around these stairways, you know, ancient, about only yay wide, you know, and spiraling maybe and so forth, and into all places you would never get to in regular life, sort of, you know. And we didn't find anything. It was pretty well cleared. Nobody was around. And came back, and then we were ordered back into town, and we stayed there for a while, overnight, and then the next day we went up to relieve A Company on the banks of the Rhine. Meanwhile, the Germans tried to float the bombs down on a raft to blow the bridge up, and then of course the jet aircraft came in, and all kinds of aircraft. try to blow that bridge up. I mean, I was there when the jets came in, and that was the weirdest sound in the world. Totally unfamiliar with it, you know what it was. And that was one time, so your legs turned kind of jelly. You didn't know what do I do? Do I stay up? Do I go down? What is this sort of thing? And then they were gone. And I had dropped the bombs that skipped under the bridge and over the bridge, in the water. Very accurate, and that was the first jet experience. That was sort of as we found out, later on, it was look back and say, yeah, that had to be a pretty eerie thing because that jet only had a very short time in the air. They had to use up most of their space for fuel in the aircraft, and it had to take off nearby, Of course, it had to take off and have a target, almost immediately. So that kind of thing went on for a while. Foxholes and trenches and so forth got to be interesting because people started improving on them every day, and then began to tunnel from one to the other, and bring in more straw and so forth, And even though, one unit was relieving the other, while, they moved into better quarters, you might say, in the ground, And it was the second day or something up there. There was a correspondent up there, and I was talking with him, and he talked to me for quite a while. And I could only tell him what little I actually knew, but for some reason or other, he kind of hung with me, And then after he had finished that sort of conversation, then he said to me, where do you come from? And I told him I'm from Long Island, New York. And he said, shucks, he says, I'm from the Boston Globe in Massachusetts. So that was the end of a story, you might say, that might be published in the paper, So, and anyway, we hung around there a couple of days, and then we took off and kept going into Austria, and right on down, to go through Munich and down into Oberau and Oberammergau and so forth. We were headed for Innsbruck, for the Brenner Pass. But on the way, the platoon had to take a small town, but obviously the Germans were still convinced, that they were going to withdraw as much equipment as they could and so forth, and a lot of it was leaving from and through this town. And we had an all-day fight. This was in April, the end of April. And we had a lot of people wounded. I don't remember anybody being killed, but a lot of people wounded. And actually the AT platoon received one of its severest blows at the end of the day, and I walked away from a very serious happening where one on this side, one in front, and one on the other side, were hit. There was a blast that came under the track from mortar fire, and banged up the undercarriage of the track, and right front tire was flat. Those tires are yay big, And I got out of there somehow. I was banged into a wall, like my whole right side, and my helmet flew off, I guess, at one point, or it was in such an angle, you know, my head and everything, you know, went into it, and I went down. And at the same time, I was hit with rock, I guess. As it turned out, that was hot, you know, and I could feel it. And then I said to myself, I guess I'm hit, you know. And as it turned out, it was rock that was picked up. It was just that hot from the moment, you know, it was hit, and in seconds, you know, going that way. Well, this was the beginning of raining mortar shells coming in. And every time I tried to get up out of the position, I would go down again, and from a concussion of the shells and so forth. But finally, I scratched out of there and ran into a courtyard and into where we had been before. We had cleared a lot of these buildings. We had taken a lot of prisoners and so forth. And here we are, you know, literally being caught in the open. Now, we didn't have the tracks. The tracks were just called up. We were supposed to mount up. We were supposed to go off again at the end of the day and attack another town that night. So as it wound up, you know, the strength had been so whittled down that we couldn't do it. But however, the track driver was injured, and it was only myself and a new driver and one other rifleman, I guess, in my squad. And the other tracks only had maybe 6 people or 3 people or whatever, I've forgotten. Literally, the platoon was cut in half, strength-wise. And some were seriously wounded, and I had eventually taken the track driver and gave him as much first aid as I possibly could in a house. I mean, I dragged him, or he fell in my arms, actually, when he was trying to get away somehow. And this is quite a few moments after, and then he appeared in the doorway, and he said my legs, and sort of passed out. So I grabbed him and brought him into a room and put him under a sink that was in the corner of a room, because the place would get hit, you know, there was plaster coming down and things like that, you know, and cut his pant leg down both sides, and I could see his legs were like sieves. And put the sulfur powder, you know, on the legs, gave him wound tablets, and he was sort of like in and out of it, you know. And with that, it had lifted, and the medics were right up there with their Jeep ambulances and so forth, and taking people out. And then we were ordered out to go and start clearing buildings, because there was somebody in that town, obviously, with a radio, and they were directing that fire that was missed. Right? And sure enough, that's the way it happened. I mean, I didn't see the individual and so forth, but the story came out later on. It was somebody that was missed. I went into some buildings. We're talking about a peasant town, so we're literally talking about, you know, people who left the town, you know, and farmed, you know, outside. And everybody seemed to have you know, like a small courtyard and a barn area and a house area, and nothing palatial, that's for sure. I mean, it was, you know, typical peasant situation. And I don't know particularly what kind of like being in a chicken coop or whatever that we went into, you know, looking see if we could find anybody. And of course, I wound up seeing something that I will never forget. And it only something like this, you know, in an interview, or will come up, and I remember this vividly, on some boards in this place, which were every mishmash way, you know, there was some sort of lumber on the floor, you know, and everything. And the squad leader that was with me, you know, at the time, and we both looked, and we said, you know, he said to me, "Gee, look at this." And I looked down, and there were two small hands, baby's hands, laid out on the board. They had obviously been ripped or chopped or pulled out, you know, the bone portion, you know. These two little hands were on this board. Now, I saw a lot, and I saw bodies in streets. I seen what was left, you know, of German soldiers and so forth in the street that you couldn't tell from left to right, head to toe, because they were so out of shape and bent up and so forth. And I saw them in the snow, I saw them frozen, I saw them hit in the head and the legs, you know, and really cut open. But when I saw those hands, that was too much. And I'll never forget it, you know. But, if you want to talk about, you know, one thing, you know, emotionally and so forth, that was it. But any time that you saw a child, really, you know, that was injured or hurt, you saw some civilians, you know, they were getting away, you know. I mean, and I don't know what they were thinking of as civilians, you know. We saw many times women. I don't know what they were thinking of that got in the way somehow, you know, and were killed. But anyway, we don't know. We don't know. There was nothing else around. It was the strangest thing. You know, why this little person was dismembered like that, you know? So, after that, it was a matter of just moving on and keep going. Now, if it sounds monotonous, that's what our day was.
Yeah.
Excepting, you know, as they say, you know, moments of sheer agony, you know, to nothing,
Yeah.
you know.
Why don't we go ahead and finish off just like the end of the war?
Mm-hmm.
We have about 15 minutes left on that
Yeah.
tape, so.
Well, on that particular day also, I can tell you that I was pretty near killed 3 times. I walked away and got out of a ditch. I didn't walk. I mean, I got out. A sniper had me dead to rights, and I could barely move. I wore glasses, and it was the steel rim GI glasses, and the only thing I could figure out is he saw the gleam, or he might have seen me move, and he saw the reflection. I just was able to move back a little bit because we were in a ditch head to toe. And I heard, well, fortunately, I heard the thump right across here into the ground. And I just moved a little bit, and the second thump came in right across in the same spot into the ground. So then I hit the guy in the helmet behind me, and so I moved back. I said, I got somebody that's got me spotted. And well, we were staying in the ditch outside of the town that morning. This place was called Unterplattfelden, and I've been trying to find it on a map forever. But at one point, we were ordered to go back and get the guns. We had dropped the guns outside down the road, so we did. We went back, brought the guns up because the company commander had convoy moving off on our right flank. So we brought the guns up and set them up. We started shooting at about 1,500 yards or so. and they were horse-drawn convoy, and they looked like gypsy caravan, you know, moving out, and we really disrupted that thing, you know, horses flying up in the air and so forth. And then we started to draw fire, mortar fire coming in, and then he ordered this, okay, pull the guns out of here. So, okay, pull the guns out. Now you got to go back, you got to pick up the trails, you got to close the trails that are coming, you got to back the tracks in, you know, you got to hook up the gun and get out of there. And while we were doing this, there, obviously, I think there was some small arm fire that was coming at us. But anyway, I wasn't about to try to get into the track from the rear. I just stayed on the front and threw myself on the hood of the track. And the driver was buttoned up, and he just had, you know, slits that he could look out the windshield. So I directed him off the field as we got far enough away, off the field and up a little incline to get back up on the road. We got back there, dropped the guns, came back up to the show again. And then we started into the first house. A tanker, Sherman, came up, and there were people in that house firing back at us and so forth. And they blew a hole in the side of the house, and then we rushed up and we went through the side of the house after we, you know, blew the hole in there. And we got the two clowns out, and they were seriously wounded, and one in the head, and he was, I don't know whether he was blind or not, but he couldn't see where the hell he was going, and the other guy was carrying him on his back, and he was wounded too, but he could still walk, you know. So we got them out, and then we pushed on to the next house, you know, through courtyards and so forth. That went all the way on, all day long, you know, and on both sides of the street until that afternoon when I told you about, you know, what happened. You know, after that, I don't remember. We were pretty safe, you know. There was always the fear of sniper fire. And the next thing you know, we're looking at the Alps, you know, and it was getting cold again. And we said, what is this? You're getting cold. And then we found out, holy mackerel, you know, we're down and looking at the Swiss Alps, you know, the Austrian Alps and so forth. And had to dig the field jackets out again and so forth to be comfortable, you know. And then our situation was over, and went back to Ellwangen, Germany, which wasn't too far away back up the line, and we started our occupation duty. And my occupation service then turned into another interesting, in a way, you know, history of my own, you know, personal activities. I didn't get to come home when the rest of the crowd was leaving because they dropped the bomb. And I was in Namur, Belgium, and I went shipped back to Germany and spent another almost like 8 or 9 months back in Germany. I didn't have enough points to come home, you know, like right away. Initially I was being sent home because we were going to go to the Pacific. But I wound up in a railway security battalion. I became an operations sergeant in a railway security battalion. We were guarding, our mission was to guard freight, American freight and German freight that was actually began to move a bit in September and October and November. And we're coming into one of the worst winters again in Europe. And people were without fuel and food and a lot of things, you know. And American troops were still being pretty well supplied, you know, with necessities to live. But I wound up some pretty hairy things, you know, that happened. And I was also with another individual on a trail or something, which turned out to be a German black market ring. And they were stealing from their own, let alone from the American freight. So then we were sort of like known, and that got to be around April, I guess April or May. So I was eventually told that I was coming home. It was about time, but that particular scary situation meant that we were no more use, I guess, to, and then it wasn't comfortable to be known, you know, through their grapevine, you know. Well, I didn't move around too much after that, but prior to that, I could move around quite a bit. I mean, into other towns and up and down the railroad that we covered, which went through places like Frankfurt and Hanau and Gießen and Fulda, and going on up to Kassel, Germany. And I got into a lot of these places that I wouldn't ordinarily say. And I had a driver. I had a German interpreter. And it was quite an interesting thing. I met another individual there that had been in the 12th Armored Division in a different unit, and he was the company commanders or the battery commanders, because it was railway security, but they still call them a battery. You know, they had been a field, they had been an ACAC battery, and then eventually it turned over to companies. And I made friends with the company commander's Jeep driver, which meant that we wasn't using it. We always had a vehicle. You know. So we used to drive into Frankfurt. We were 18 miles away from Frankfurt. Frankfurt was a pile of rubble, but there was some life down there. There were movie houses that were still in existence, and the military government was now in existence, and, you know, put things back into operation, so there were movies in town. And that was a biggie, you know, you go see a movie. And there was a Red Cross set up in what was left of a hotel across the street from the main Bahnhof. And then there was some sports activity across the main river there. I was in a church, a cathedral there that was built, I think, originally in the 1200s and had been rebuilt, I think, once or twice after that, and now in World War II was pretty well destroyed again. I mean, Frankfurt was a mess. And that's where General Eisenhower's headquarters was moved up to Frankfurt in what they call the IG Farben building. And it was a massive building. IG Farben Works, you know, was like the big prime movers, you know, like the Krupp Works, you know, and so forth in Germany. And
so when did you return home then?
I returned home in June '46. And from the day I started and the day I got home, I was 2 years of service and never stopped moving.
Literally.
And as I say, for occupation, I was like a lot more fortunate than a lot of other people in occupation with a humdrum job, still in the infantry division or something. We were practically on our own, even though there were higher headquarters. We had one officer that I got to know very well, who was the commander. He was a first lieutenant, and then sometimes I had an executive officer, sometimes, but actually it was only one officer, and a first sergeant, and some orderly room clerk, you know, with some sort of rank, and about sometimes 70, sometimes 90 people who were assigned, and that was my job as an operations sergeant, you know, to see that they were signed and it was done fairly, because they would go out in twos aboard the freight trains, and they had to guard those freights en route. They'd be gone for 2 and 3 days sometimes, you know, and come back, and then they would go on the bottom of the list and work their way up again, you know, to another assignment. And sometimes it could be pretty rapid. Sometimes people that went out first didn't necessarily get back, you know. So you had to try to balance things out, you know, a little bit to be fair about it. And then you had people being sent home, and then sometimes you had some new people being sent in, you know. It was a lot of turmoil, you know, it was going on. I was very happy to leave because a lot of the veteran type people were gone. New people were coming in from the States that, you know, really didn't know. You know, they had no experience whatsoever. They were in the Army, and that's all they knew. They thought they were still coming to a war, but they weren't, you know, and that you had to tone them down, you know. You didn't go around, you know, knocking civilians around and things of that nature. And a lot of these guys were off the wall besides. They couldn't handle alcohol. I'm not saying that all the vet troop could either, but these people were quite young. I was pretty young myself, but I had been around, you know, longer, and I was responsible, you know, for people. And I'm talking about people putting their fist through glass and giving me grief, you know, because they were cut up and doing some pretty wacky things. You know, I told him, company commander had asked me to, he was being reassigned, and he had asked me if I would go with him, and I said, no, I'm going home. I don't want any more of this. I've had it. And when I got home, a fellow from Connecticut, who I got to know a bit in the 12th, had been also assigned to this organization, and he had a ways to go himself in occupation, but he was a guy that had a good head on his shoulders, and he functioned, you know, properly. And he wrote me a letter and told me, you know, he says, things were like a Wild West show after you left, he said, and even one guy jumped off the roof of the schoolhouse that we were billeted in. We had taken over a billet, a schoolhouse, you know, to put the troops in, put our orderly room in, and things like that. Prior to that, we had been living in a place, a small town called Brookhoble, and there we were in a town, you know, kind of spread out in the houses, and had a town hall that we could use for recreation, and we had some other sort of a hall, you know, that had a kitchen in it, so our mess hall was in there, you know. So.
Well, I think that'll probably do it, don't you?
Hmm?
We're pretty close, aren't we?
Yeah. I only could fill you in on other things that I would have to think about, you know, that. But I was in a firefight one time in some sort of I don't know whether it was an apple orchard or what. I mean, it was an orchard because the way the trees were planted and so forth. And this was near the end of the war, and we were supposed to go around behind this particular town, and there was a lot of small arms firing, and it was Germans that couldn't make up their mind, and, you know, they wanted to give up, and those who were running away, and there were a lot that was still in front of us on the ground in the position that we were moving on the ground. We were flat out on the ground, and all I can remember was fire coming through small arms fire coming through the trees, and I remember being on the other side of a picket fence. I mean, and the picket fence was being hit, and I remember after we had ceasefire, and we were waiting, and I saw this mound of dirt out in front of me about, maybe 75 feet or so. And I watched it, and all of a sudden from a tree nearby, a German came out. I mean, like that, you know, wham, and he was headed for this hole, and just before he did, I saw his leg fire. I almost fired as quickly as he moved, and I don't know. I'm pretty sure I hit him in the leg, and then after he was in that hole, I kept picking the dirt off the top of it, you know, on top of him, you know. And then there was a big white factory off about less than 100 yards, and all of a sudden we saw Germans coming back from someplace, but they were in black uniforms, and they stood out perfectly against the white of the building, and they were all headed for one door, you know, one after the other, and I don't think anybody got hit. There was an awful lot of lead that was thrown out at them, and then of course they were far enough away that it became somebody else's problem that was clearing down through the main street and so forth. This factory building had earlier been bombed and strafed, you know, by our fighters that were called in. And because I remember seeing them overhead and diving down and letting go, you know, with bombs on that particular situation. But that was, you know, fairly close in. And then all of a sudden we were told to move off, and we said, gee, we think there's still, you know, more people out there, but we're not getting as much fight. And the sergeant said, hell, I was told to bring you guys in, you know. So we came in and set up for the night in some house, blackout, completely blackout. We brought machine guns in from the track and set them up in the windows and so forth, just in case anything would happen. I can tell you about one night when we, in the snow on high ground, and we were moving around the mountain, possibly somewhere near, I think, Stuttgart, and it was very slippery, and all of a sudden our gun sort of jackknifed out, and we stopped the track, and we got out, and we were trying to unhook the gun, and when we did, it got away from us, and it ran down. Ran down, and we know just let it run itself out until it stopped, and all of a sudden it stopped and spun around, you know, and we had to go down, and they were able to back the track down and hook it up, and then make a big turn around, you know, trying to come back up on the road. But I saw 30-ton Sherman tanks that would slide on the ice and the snow, boy. You didn't want to be in the way. And I saw half tracks, you know, sliding like that. One time I saw a track that slid off the road and hit a tree. And the front end of the track was being held up by the tree, and the back end of the track was on the road, and with nothing else underneath it. So, well, they were all sights.
We've got a lot of stories from you. I can't get over how much you remember, so.
Yeah.
We might as well go ahead and end it now. I think the tape's about over, so. So, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Good.